One particular body or profession of individuals that may have had as much impact as any other group in America in securing American independence was pastors. Not only had they talked about all these issues in the pulpit, but when it came time to actually go on the battlefield and fight, they were at the forefront of congregations. Pastors were clergy. Right out front. I'll give you a great example. We all learn in school about the story of Paul Revere writing to let them know the British are coming.
Right.
There's a lot more to that story than we hear. I mean, in several ways. Not only on the pastor's side, but also writing that same night with Paul Revere was an African-American patriot named Wentworth Cheswell. Now, it turns out that Revere is headed to the west to let them know the British are coming, and Wentworth Cheswell went north to let them know the British are coming, but the two took off. And we hear about Revere because the British actually did go west and not north. Well, where is it that Revere is writing to let the Americans know that the British are coming? He's writing to the home of one man, the Reverend Jonas Clark. That's where he's headed, one place. Why Clark's home? Well, he was in Lexington. The British were going to Lexington to take the stores there and take the ammunition, the stores of supplies they had. So he's writing to let Reverend Clark know. Well, why not let the mayor know or something? No, he's writing to let Reverend Clark know. Why Reverend Clark? Because that night, John Hancock and Sam Adams were staying with Reverend Clark, which they did all the time. The Reverend Clark was the most significant political leader in that community. As a matter of fact, he's the one who helped write the resolutions for Massachusetts to separate from Great Britain, become part of the United States of America. He's the guy that was sent to help write the state constitution for Massachusetts. Here's a preacher involved in all this. So, here comes Paul Revere. They finally get word, and when word arrives for Sam Adams and John Hancock that the British are coming, those two turned to Reverend Jonas Clark and looked at him and said, "Pastor, are your people ready?"
Wow.
And he says, "I've trained them for just this very moment." So when the call went out, the alarm bell rang that the British were coming. And by the way, the alarm bell that rang was the bell in his church that rang to let them know the British were coming. 150 people gathered there to meet the British. They've gathered at his church, led by him, and they were out of his church. It was his church that gathered to fight the British. Well, it turned out the British didn't come on the first alarm. So the second alarm sounds, and they regather, and there's Jonas Clark at the church. And so they go out on the green to fight the British, and he made real clear that, listen, God blesses a defensive war. He doesn't bless an offensive war, so don't you fire the first shot. Wow. And that was real simple. If they fired us, let them have it, but don't you fire the first shot. And so when that first shot was fired, by the time the volley was over, the shot heard around the world, by the time it's all over, what you have is 18 Americans laying there on Lexington Green. 8 of them were dead, 10 of them were wounded. All of them were out of his church. And so here, Paul Revere is writing to find this preacher, because that's where the patriot leaders are, is with this preacher. And when it comes time to fight, it's the preacher that gets the church to go out there and defend their rights. Well, as the British start moving from Lexington back to Boston along the way, they find the closer they get to Boston, the more opposition they find. It wasn't just fighting 100 Americans out at Lexington. By the time they get back to Boston, there's several thousand Americans lining the road, sniping at them from both sides with rifles. Where'd those guys come from? Wentworth Cheswell, the patriot, strong Christian, black American who went north to warn them, let them know the British are coming, so they got together and came south to meet the British. So as the British are coming back along the road to Boston, he's put out the alarm, and all these guys are gathering along. And it's amazing how many of the groups along the road were pastors who went and grabbed their own rifle, assembled their church, and took their men to meet the British as they were coming back. So Jonas Clark is one example. By the way, this is the sermon that he preached the very next year after Lexington. This is Pastor Clark. This is a very famous sermon that he delivered and gave. And this particular sermon is recounting the 1-year anniversary of what the British did to start the American Revolution. It's his congregation, his folks. And I'll tell you, his eyewitness account is pretty remarkable on what happened. Who are the leaders most responsible for the movement in America that led to our independence? Today we hear names like Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution; Thomas Jefferson, the principal author of the Declaration; John Hancock, the President of Congress with his bold signature on the Declaration; and John Adams, who not only signed the Declaration but who also negotiated and signed the peace treaty with Great Britain to secure our independence. These are indeed important political leaders behind our independence, but in previous generations we also knew about other important leaders. In fact, John Adams himself declared that the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew and the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper were two of the individuals, quote, most conspicuous, the most ardent and influential in the, quote, awakening and revival of American principles and feelings that led to our independence. Other ministers whose influence and leadership was also important included the Reverend George Whitefield, the Reverend James Caldwell, the Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, and his brother, the Reverend Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, and many more. By the way, the exploits of many of these ministers are recorded in several older historical works, including The Pulpit of the American Revolution from 1860, The Patriot Preachers of the American Revolution, also from 1860, and The Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution from 1861. Yet today we don't hear much about the role of the church, of ministers and Christians, in the founding of our civil government. So on what basis could John Adams say that pastors in particular and Christians in general were so influential in our move for independence? Because of the work of pastors in shaping the worldview of the nation and because of the work of Christians in founding our government. One of the chief advocators of American independence was the Reverend George Whitefield. Now, we might have heard about Reverend Whitefield from the First Great Awakening, but we weren't told that George Whitefield is the guy who was urging Americans to separate from Great Britain. He said Great Britain is trying to force an established church on you. They're trying to take your liberties away, both civil and religious. Unless you separate, you won't preserve your liberties. We don't consider that to be part of revival preaching. It was part of the American Great Awakening revival. So Whitefield had such a substantial impact that not only did he go to Parliament to argue for the Americans when they did the Stamp Act in 1765, but he did so many things militarily wise to help the Americans get ready for it that when it came time, he died in 1770. He's buried in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and back then when they buried individuals, they often buried them inside the church. And in the case of very prominent ministers, they would kind of make a sarcophagus for them and put them perhaps down in the basement. A lot of other famous individuals they literally buried in the aisles of the church. So they took and buried Whitefield down in the basement of the church. As the first troops are getting ready to leave from Massachusetts to go up and to try to engage the British as they're in Canada, up toward Quebec, etc., as they're getting ready to leave Newburyport to go to that battle in Canada, they stopped by the church where Whitefield was buried. They had a sermon preached there to the entire military before they left. And then the leader of the military, followed by all the guys, went downstairs. They lifted the top off that sarcophagus where Whitefield is buried. Now, this is 5-6 years after he's dead, so he's quite decayed. They reached inside that casket and started cutting pieces off his robe to take with them into battle because he was their inspirational leader for American independence. They wanted to take this remembrance of the hero and what their hero had done and told them into battle.
During the Revolutionary War of the 1700s, the local church, pastors, and clergymen played a pivotal role in the founding of our nation. But how did the church respond to such lingering issues as slavery and civil rights? Is there still a role for churches and pastors to play in today's political arena? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series.